Content warning. This episode contains discussion of rape, violence, and murder.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Cheat Sheet. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we're going to be talking about some of the cases we've covered over time and giving you some quick updates about what's going on in everything from the murder of Laurel Jean Mitchell to what we're planning in the Burger Chef murders case and the Long Island serial killer case and the Idaho murders case. In addition to that, we're going to be discussing a few new cases in this week's episode, including the murder of Jared Bridegan and the murder of Rachel Morin. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murder Sheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases. We're The Murder Sheet, and this is...
The Cheat Sheet. AirTags and Indictments.
Why don't we start off by updating some of the cases we discussed last week?
Yeah, great idea. So, very tragically, Katie Schneider, the 17-year-old Saratoga, California resident who went missing, her body has been found. Family updated the news media about this, and all indications from what they're saying is that this was a tragic car accident and that they're not suspecting foul play. So, obviously, our condolences to her family and loved ones. That's just a horrible way to lose a child and to be not knowing for this long.
Have there been any updates in the case of the Perez sisters?
As far as I could find, no. But 15-year-old Tamara Perez and her 14-year-old younger sister Iris are still missing from Roscommon County in Michigan. Let's keep talking about them. We'll share the FBI's link to their case in our show notes. But remember, these girls disappeared from their adoptive family's home. They have connections to people in the Midwest. And obviously, when you have two missing teenagers, even if it's a runaway situation, that's a potentially dangerous situation for them. So we're hoping that, we can all raise a bit of awareness on that.
One thing that's sad but true is there is always more missing persons cases, and we thought we'd highlight a recent one that's local. This is the case of Rachel Saloman. She's a 28-year-old woman missing in Indianapolis. She was last seen on August 13th on the west side of Indianapolis.
And if you have seen her, we'll be including a WRTV link with her photo. Take a look at it, study it if you're based in Indianapolis. And if you see her, please call the IMPD Missing Persons Unit at 317-327-6160. They believed her to be in possible danger, and it's important that she gets found.
We covered the case of Ronli Ratliff recently. What can people do to help with that case?
Absolutely. We want to keep Ronli Ratliff's name in the news. This is, of course, the 24-year-old young woman who was murdered in 2004, and she was discovered in a house in Morgan County, Indiana, that was burning. Her aunt, Kim Sink, has been working for years to raise awareness and find answers in this case. And unfortunately, no one has yet been charged with her murder. One correction from our initial coverage of her, we learned that Ronli was actually found to the side of the couch, next to the couch in the burning home, not on the couch. I believe we stated her body was found on the couch at the time. So we updated our show notes with that correction, but we also just want to know whenever we get something wrong like that, we're going to state that and put it in our show notes and update in future coverage. So wanted to flag that. The other thing is that one thing that I feel could be helpful is that we know that Kim's belief is that essentially drug abuse amongst people who knew Ronli is what led to her death. It was somehow connected to drugs. Ronli herself was a straight shooter, not involved in drugs. She was not a drug user. She actually very much was upset by the fact that her mother was using drugs, her mother, Sandra Allen. And what happened was Sandra Allen and her husband, Robert, were both addicted to drugs at this time. And there was a lot of drug activity at their business, the Allen's Body Shop in Mooresville. So if you are knowledgeable about the drug abuse that was going on at the Allen's Body Shop in Mooresville in the early 2000s, we would love it if you could email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. We protect our sources, okay? So if you were doing drugs back then and you don't want people to know, you just want to talk to us, we will keep you safe. That's what we do again and again in these cases. But we'd love to get a better sense of the drug ecosystem and maybe some of the figures that Ronli was unfortunately coming into contact because she worked there and she was also trying to get her mom to get out of that situation.
This is a very sad story, how sometimes even if you're not personally connected to the drug scene or particular criminal scene, you can still be sucked into it if people you love are connected to it, and you still end up paying a pretty high price.
Absolutely. Well said.
Why don't we give a sneak peek at some of the things we are working on?
Certainly. So one thing that we've been talking about doing is today, August 18th, 2023, when we're actually recording this cheat sheet episode. We know that this has been touted as a big day for the University of Idaho murders, the slayings of Kaylee Gonsalves, Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, and Madison Mogen. And of course, Brian Kohberger is the man who is accused of perpetrating that massacre. And what we've been hearing is that basically today was supposed to be a hearing that was supposed to take care of a bunch of different issues in the case. The prosecution wanted to raise, the defense wanted to raise. So we are going to be, if we determine that a lot of things happened today and we have enough to talk about, we'll probably be trying to do an episode featuring that next week at some point, whether that is its own separate episode or just a portion of next week's cheat sheet. That remains to be determined, but we are kind of keeping an eye on that and seeing what sort of learnings and gleanings we can take from that.
And you see that hearing is happening today, even probably as we're recording. And since I'm talking about recording, I want to quickly mention we neglected to mention that we are recording at a library.
Yes, we're at the Hamilton County Library, and we've been able to use their excellent Ignite studios a few times recently. So shout out to them. Very cool little podcast studio they have here. So
yes, and we're actually here because we just completed an interview with somebody that might run next week, a person called Mr. Murder. So that should be an interesting interview.
Yes.
Mr. Murder is not connected to Burger Chef, but we are still working on Burger Chef as well. There's a lot of files to go through and digest. We've talked to some people about the contents of some of those files. We're probably going to be releasing another episode on that soon where we talk some more about what we think is important with the files, and we'll discuss some of the ideas and questions that people have emailed us about.
Yeah, Burger Chef is one of those cases that is always very close to Kevin and my hearts because that's what we, initially started working on and how we met actually. But I think with Burger Chef, we used to do the podcast where every November we would do a whole slew of Burger Chef coverage. And that was good for a while, but we're at a point where if we try to plan anything, it blows up in our faces in a horrible way. So we are just determined to keep on just doing Burger Chef wherever. So that's no longer constrained. I flag that. If you're a newer listener, you don't care what I'm talking about. You're going to say, what are you talking about, Anya? But if you are an OG listener who's been listening for a long time and you're looking for us to do a lot of Burger Chef coverage in November, we're not going to, but that also means that we're going to be doing Burger Chef coverage throughout the year. We got into a pattern of sitting on stuff with Burger Chef and waiting for November, and we're just kind of like, nah.
So over the next month or two, we're going to have some more episodes on the FBI files, discussions about that. We continue to be very interested in ideas and questions from listeners about the case, and anything you send in, we're going to try to get answers for.
Mm-hmm. And another case that we continue to be interested in is the Long Island serial killer case. Of course, Rex Heuermann is the Long Island architect who has been accused of murdering a number of sex workers and dumping their bodies in Gilgo Beach, Long Island. That's a very tragic and disturbing case. And as a bit of a preview, we're going to be continuing to cover that. One thing we're very interested in is recent reports about a potential connection between Huerman and Las Vegas. And in addition to that, we covered the murder of Laurel Jean Mitchell, a North Webster teenager who was abducted, raped, and murdered in 1975. It's a horrible case. So there's a couple of hearings coming up in that case that I wanted to flag for people who are following. Her two alleged killers are being tried separately. One of them, John Wayne Lehman, has hearings coming up. There's going to be a hearing on motion to rule for show of cause at 10 a.m. on August 24th. And then 4 days later, on August 28th, there's going to be a pretrial conference in his case. So things are chugging along there.
You know, Anya, one thing I really like about this cheat sheet format is it gives us an opportunity to talk about cases that we've been looking at or reading about that maybe we wouldn't have covered on their own entire 30 minutes episode for one reason or another. Mm-hmm. And I know one case that fits that description is a very recent and ongoing case involving Rachel Morin.
Yes, Rachel Morin. So she is a 37-year-old mother of 5. She's devoted to her kids. She's an entrepreneur. She runs some sort of cleaning service. And on August 5th of this year, she goes for a walk on a trail, the Ma and Pa Trail that goes through Bel Air, Maryland. Her boyfriend reports her missing. August 6th, the day after she went missing, she's found murdered. All we know is that it was a violent attack. So what is this trail? It's a rails to trails sort of structure where it used to be a railroad. And then what you have in America with the decline of the railroads, you have a lot of municipalities that put money into converting them into trails. There's a lot of those in Indiana. One of the reasons why we became interested in Miss Morin's case is that there's a similarity to Delphi in terms of the setting. Abby Williams and Liberty German, the two teenagers who were murdered on February 13th, 2017, that was the Monon High Bridge. That's part of a rails to trail situation as well. It's the Monon Trail. And that goes throughout Indiana. It used to be a huge railway. And so, you know, we were not interested because, we think there's a connection, someone doing this. It was more of like, these spaces are for the community's enjoyment, for people to go out and have fun with their families or walk and take pictures and experience nature. But are we seeing people potentially use the fact that they're sort of, you know, parks and forested and maybe a little bit isolated if you target somebody at the right time? Are they using that to try to commit crimes and prey on people?
Before we get into the most recent updates, I'd like to talk about some of the things from the early discussion of the case that illustrated some things that frankly bothered me a bit about the true crime community. One of which is that Miss Morin's boyfriend had gotten in some trouble in the past. He had some criminal charges. He's a participant in drug court. And so because of this, a lot of people seem to take it for granted. Well, obviously, he's the person who must have done that. And I think it's important to remember these are real people. These are people who have lost someone very, very important to them. And it's important to not rush to accuse them at some of these worst moments of their lives of doing a horrible act unless you were really, really sure of it. And in this case, people were not sure enough of it to make those sorts of accusations, and recent developments in the case seem to bear that out.
I'm going to say this, and this is kind of how I formulated my thinking about it. Obviously, in any homicide, especially that of a woman, but let's say any homicide, because we're going to talk about a situation where a woman is accused of murdering her ex-husband here in a moment. So when you have someone die, it is natural to look at current or former romantic partners as persons of interest, because statistics bear out that person is often a perpetrator of violence against this person they're supposed to love. So I think it's absolutely fine for law enforcement, prosecutors to be looking at those people. I also think it's fine that if, you and I are talking at Starbucks about a case and we say, well, I hope they're looking at the boyfriend, that's one thing. But to me, going online and writing about it, either anonymously or otherwise, on some of these social media sites and sort of throwing accusations at people, that's taking it a step too far for me, because that's like the equivalent of almost like writing it on the bathroom walls and saying, this person's a bad person. You're actually putting it out there and sort of trying to spread your opinion to others in the very early days of the case. It's not that a lot of time has passed and perhaps the person has done more suspicious behavior or racked up more crimes, or we're seeing a pattern. It's like we're a few minutes into this essentially, and people are already pointing the finger. And what do we gain by that? What's gained? The police are already looking at these people. There's it's almost like people feel like I need to take the responsibility of doing this. And it's almost like, you don't really. So I don't get it. I mean, again, we're not saying, oh, you shouldn't, have those opinions or express them to anyone under any circumstances. It just seems like when you're it's really easy to just kind of drop this stuff anonymously online and then kind of, walk away from it like it's not a big deal. But I think it kind of is. And, if you're accusing people who are innocent and they've also just lost someone that they loved,
that's awful.
That's awful.
And one more, before we get to the recent update, one more thing. We've talked a lot in the past about how, especially in the Delphi case and in other cases too, I'm sure, people will often post information about the case on sites like Reddit or what have you. This is just simply not true. And of course, when people publish things on a social media site and it's not accurate, that's a shame, and it can be damaging, but it doesn't have the endorsement of mainstream media. And so a lot of people think, well, we shouldn't trust something unless it appears in mainstream media. So in this case, there was a person who came forward and talked to many media outlets who claimed to have found Miss Morin's body and gave a very graphic description of it. And the media outlets ran this person's story, and then law enforcement subsequently came forward and said this person was nowhere near the body and what he was describing just wasn't so. And so when even mainstream media is reporting something uncritically that turns out not to be true, that's also troubling to me.
It's troubling, and it's like when it's a disturbing incident in this case, because when law enforcement is potentially working with civilian volunteers who are giving up their time to help search for someone who's missing, it raises all sorts of disturbing questions of like, what if you have people in there who are just looking to get their 15 minutes of fame afterwards? Because it's not as if this case went cold for 20 years and the searchers coming forward to say, maybe it's time this information gets out there about what happened. It's like they've just been found and they're running to the press, and the press is happily eating it up. And it just kind of, where's the care there for essentially the case itself? Because if the person is just making this up, which is what law enforcement says, then you're just running falsehoods and giving somebody, who's desperate for attention, the attention they crave. And if you are looking at a situation where they are giving details of the crime scene, well, then you've just made it a lot harder to potentially rule people out who are coming, because they're going to come forward and say, well, they're going to repeat what this guy said, and it's going to make it harder to figure out who is just mentally ill and confessing to someone, like as a cry for help or something, and then who's actually did it. So that whole thing it was just gross.
I think it's a lesson to reporters that if someone comes to you and indicates they have information because they discovered a crime scene or something like that, maybe before you run it, privately reach out to someone in law enforcement to try to verify it. Or
even if you feel like, okay, law enforcement isn't giving us anything. And listen, I think that's a problem, because I think when law enforcement shuts down, like any media discussions, then there's not that much to report on. And we've seen that become a problem in the Delphi case. But perhaps you could at least confirm the person's story with like numerous additional, when I was at Insider, if I wanted to report, okay, I mean, this is a story, like if I wanted to report, okay, IKEA employees have a problem with this new policy about like overtime or about like this how you handled something in a store, then I needed to get like multiple, like, I mean, ideally like scores of IKEA employees telling me the same thing. And I would always do it this way. I would try not to lead them. I would try not to be like, so what do you think about that new store policy? I'd talk to them and kind of, if we got onto that topic, I'd try to, nail that down. But I wouldn't be trying to say, oh, does it make you mad? Because you don't want to direct people. And so I don't know where that level of like hesitation and trying to, nail something down before reporting it was here.
I guess we're getting a bit meta by talking about the coverage of the case rather than case itself.
Yeah, but
why don't you give us an update?
Well, before we begin, I will say we did appear on Court TV to speak to some of this, and I really do appreciate Julia Grant was the anchor that night, and we had there was a Kelly Swoop, who's the anchor for WMAR, and retired NYPD detective Joseph Jackalone. And I felt like the conversation was very much grounded in like, we don't know who is, the suspect yet, so we shouldn't speculate. And I thought that was really a great discussion. So I was really pleased with that media coverage. And what we've learned now is that there's a DNA hit. They've gotten DNA from the crime scene, and they've matched it to a suspect. And unfortunately, we don't know this person's name yet, but here's what the Hartford County Sheriff's Office put out there about this DNA match. They say the suspect is 5'9", 160 pounds. He's in his early to mid 20s and is likely Hispanic. How do we know this? Well, he's wanted for the assault of a young child during a home invasion that occurred in Los Angeles, California in March. And there is a video out there. We are including a link to the video in our show notes. Please watch this. But this captures this man exiting the home in Los Angeles that he just invaded, where he assaulted the child. So we don't have the name, we don't have the location, we just have the DNA and a general description. Let's watch this video. Let's see if we can identify this guy. That's very important right now. And what the sheriff's office has said is that this indicates that what this points to is possibly a stranger attacking Rachel Morin as she was walking alone. Now, the Mom Pa Trail, it sounds like it's a high traffic area for the community. People are walking on all the time, but unfortunately, violent men do target women who are jogging or walking alone sometimes, and sometimes they get lucky and nobody sees anything or nobody hears anything in time to help this woman. So these cases make me so angry because it's so often some maladjusted young man who basically values their own sexual pleasure over a woman's life. And I think there's something just so disgusting and reprehensible about that. But so this person is obviously doing crimes against vulnerable people who can't fight them off, and they need to be caught. If you have information, you can reach the Hartford Sheriff's Office at 410-836-7738, or you can email rmtips@hartfordsheriff.org. Let me say something about tips. It's important that, they stay focused and relevant. So no one needs to email the sheriff's office saying, hey, have you tried this or that? What they need is information about this person. So I think it's always important to kind of, not bury them with a lot of speculation. It's important for everybody, to kind of set some boundaries with that in cases that are ongoing, and focus on, whether or not you have information about the suspect.
Moving on, Andy Baldwin's law firm, the criminal defense team, recently was involved in a pretty interesting murder trial, which we did not cover, but we're thinking about possibly doing a full episode on it in the future. Now, Andy Baldwin didn't work on this case. The defense was handled by Max Wiley and Kathy Perry. The prosecutor on the case was Michelle Sharp. Can you tell us the facts of that case?
This murder case stemmed from an incident that took place on June 3rd, 2022. So here's what happens. A 26-year-old man named Andre Smith is in a relationship with a 27-year-old woman named Galen Morris, and he's cheating on her. So she puts an Apple AirTag into the back of his car so she can track him and stalk him, essentially. She uses this technology to follow him to Tilly's Pub in Indianapolis, where he is with another woman. She shows up around 12:32 a.m., and witnesses confirm this, workers and people who were, around. There's a scene. She's trying to throw bottles. I mean, it's a mess. And everybody is asked to leave Tilly's Pub. In the parking lot, things get really horrifying. Morris gets into the car and drives at Andre Smith, pinning him under the car. She's seems to be going back and forth, hitting him multiple times. She clips an employee in the process, and he ultimately asphyxiates beneath the car. It's a pretty horrifying death. So the question is that murder? What the defense is arguing is that it's really more manslaughter because she's dealing with a sudden heat. They maintain that Andre Smith was cheating on her for a very long time. She felt very used. She's paying for their lifestyle, the bills, the rent. And when she gets to the bar and sees that he's with another woman, she freaks out, lashes out in anger. The prosecution is arguing, no, this is murder. So they charge her with murder. What happened was on Thursday, she was actually on August 17th, she was instead found guilty of voluntary manslaughter.
So a lesser charge than murder.
A lesser charge than murder, and according to Fox 59 and Law and Crime, that is a level 2 felony and it can carry a sentence of up to 30 years. So she'll be sentenced on September 21st at 10 a.m., but the criminal defense team seemingly was able to get her a lesser charge, not the murder that was originally proposed, which is, obviously a pretty big deal for the defense team to be able to accomplish that. From the prosecution's perspective, she still could go away for a long time. So I'm imagining that there'll be arguments over mitigating and aggravating factors that would factor into that. But yeah, so that's sort of how things went down in that case. So we'll be curious to see what sort of sentence.
It makes me wonder about some of the details that maybe didn't get reported about this case. And so I don't know. I'm thinking about.
I read the PCA. It was pretty bad.
I'm thinking about maybe reaching out to somebody to talk about the case with us, or maybe even attending the sentencing. I don't know.
Yeah.
Let's see what happens.
Yeah, definitely.
It's always a lot going on.
Yeah, it's an interesting case. And whenever you're sort of seeing a murder charge go into manslaughter, it's sort of like the jury obviously found something compelling about the defendant's story, but still think that punishment is necessary here to deal with this young man being killed in this way, because I mean, hopefully this is obvious to everyone listening, but, nobody should be getting murdered for, cheating on somebody. That's a very horrible thing to do. But, there's ways of dealing with that that do not involve running somebody over with your car.
Let's do one more case. Tell us about Shanna Lee Gardner.
Okay, so this is something that's been brewing for a while, and I know a lot of our listeners have been following this case. Jared Bridegan was a Microsoft executive, and let's in his case, he was horribly murdered. A grand jury just indicted his ex-wife, Shanna Lee Gardner Fernandez. So what happened? So let's go back to the beginning. On February 16th, 2022, Jared Bridegan, he's just dropped off his 9-year-old twins that he shares with Shanna at her house in the neighborhood of Jacksonville Beach in Florida. So he's driving back home to St. Augustine with his toddler daughter that he shares with his new wife. She's only 2. As he's leaving, there's a tire blocking his way, seemingly. So he gets out of his vehicle, and police and his wife, Kirsten, have said that they believe he was shot when he got out to move this thing. It was a trap. It was almost like an ambush. And the thing about that is at this point, he's been doing this routine. He's been dropping off the twins. So somebody would have potentially known that. And we had a situation where the first person arrested was somewhat unexpected. This man named Henry Tenon. He's in his 60s. He doesn't know Jared. Who is this guy, basically? But I think this is one area where people were speculating on the internet. And in fairness, in this case, they turned out to be correct, that there's got to be more to this. Is this Tenon guy really the person police suspect of doing it? Or do they think he's a trigger man? So subsequently, a man named Mario Fernandez is arrested. He is the current husband of Shanna Gardner Fernandez. Then on August 17th, Shanna is arrested in Washington State. She's going to be extradited to Florida. So we're having what looks like what police believe to be some sort of conspiracy to commit murder, where you have the ex-wife and her current husband targeting her former partner in this really horrible way. Because, I mean, they're basically allegedly using his connection to her to kill him as he's dropping off small children that they share in front of his other child. I mean, it's just a really sick situation. Now, one thing, I've actually talked with a couple of sources about Shanna Gardner, people who are actually familiar with one angle of her life that I find very interesting. She is essentially a member of a very wealthy family that is quite influential within the multi-level marketing scheme space. So for a number of years, when I was on the business beat, I did reporting on multi-level marketing schemes, or MLMs. They are businesses that critics describe as extremely predatory for those who get sucked in, and where typically the people who make a lot of money with them are the people who found them or get in very early, and everybody else is kicking up to the top. So that's what critics say. Yeah, it's a very sad situation where this man lost his life. It seems like he had a very positive relationship with his new wife, who he shared this child with. That shattered. This is anytime you're dealing with a contested divorce or contentious divorce, we all know tempers can rise, but I mean, like, hopefully people realize that, like, it's never worth doing this. Obviously, they are innocent until proven guilty, so I'll be curious to see their defense. If they're saying, well, maybe the police jumped to conclusions, or we've been ensnared in a way that was unfair, I think we'd be eager to hear them out on that. But at the same time, if it turns out to be true, and if it turns out that there's good evidence against them, then, like, killing your children's father is just, I mean, why putting them through that trauma? I just don't understand. Well, thanks again for the support from the Hamilton County Library. We very much appreciate them. And we will keep you posted about some of these cases and more in our next cheat sheet episode next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.
Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for the Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.